welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with our weekly Q&A content. You're probably on YouTube based off of download and view metrics. So if you're here, you can check links in the description to access this on a bunch of different podcasting platforms for an easier way to take it on the go with you or have it on in the background if you've only got one device. And if you're on the podcast, you probably already know about our YouTube channel. But just on the off chance you don't, we're BDCKR Gaming on YouTube. The same thing on the podcast.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my pitch. I think, in my opinion, the best way to consume this content is usually actually on podcast mode, as long as you are not watching actively sort of what's going on in the video.
Right.
And now you're going to explain what's actively going on in the video.
Right. So we do our opposite pitches because despite the feedback we've gotten, there's actually an interesting comment. I should have pulled that about code switching and how they're enjoying listening to us. That I think there's still, I try to put enough value in the video part of it that you're not wasting your time if you actually watch the video, because there's going to be interesting stuff, especially this season 11, which is informally the season of the Lost Challenge characters. And for those who haven't been following along, the Lost Challenge characters are those who have not been part of the challenge character cycle. So there's a 43-week challenge character cycle, but there are 66 challenge characters that have been introduced to the game. So there's 23 of them that have not been around since before May 2020. So this week in our series of Lost Challenge characters, it's Darkseid Prime, not the good one. And I mean, it's not that he's bad. Let's be honest. But I want to point out that maybe this week I'm making more of an effort to go into the kind of detail that we would in the weekly recaps, because I feel like, you know what, we're probably going to be seeing less of these characters than we do the weekly recaps. We put so much more effort and so much more detail and information in those. We really should make it more of an effort with these characters who are not going to get the chance to shine the same way. And Darkseid. So his passive is Empower Minions. All bronze characters on Darkseid's team gain plus 300 health and damage.
He's got 1,050 attack. He's got 1,200 health.
Right.
Yeah. And right now, those are okay stats, right?
They're not, well, they're sort of middle class stats.
Yeah, for golds anyways.
Yeah,
They're in the range where you're not going to be feeling him being significantly weaker than other people, but there are definitely higher stat choices.
Right.
But when he was released, he had basically the highest stats in the game. He was like top 3 for highest global stats.
I think maybe Shazam was the only one that had higher attack, but they were very similar. So they were high enough that the best defensive team at that time was Shazam Prime, Godfall Superman, and Darkseid. Right? So as we now know, and previously assumed, multiplayer matchups were based on a calculation using the stats of your team. And as you go higher in the ladder, the stats of your opponents will increase above that of your team. So when there are a handful of characters that have higher stats than everybody else, then a team made up of those high stat characters become the default matchup at the end of an ultimate ladder with teams that are at or are near the top.
Yeah, because by the time you complete ladders, sort of they climb a little bit, but by the longer ladders, you're playing with people who are pretty high above you in terms of stats, as long as there's more sort of room above you to go.
Right.
And so, when you have the highest stat characters, it ends up collecting everybody underneath it for a decent range. It's anybody who's close to that high stats, and for significant range down, you're seeing you need at least one fight with that team, like with stats that high for every single team.
Right. I mean, the wild thing to me is that this team has absolutely zero synergy, right? They do nothing to improve each other. There is nothing that makes this team as a collective better than their individual parts. But by virtue of drawing a large number of fights and winning a small percentage of them, then you could generate a lot of defensive wins that are worth twice as many battle points as an offensive win.
Yeah.
So to give you the example, I mean, we didn't do documentation back then nearly as much as we do now because there's just so much going on. We were covering 3 different games, and I think some of this stuff got lost in wayside. But I remember my memory being a little bit faulty, but still some of the details stand out. There was a season where we had more than 100 wins by drawing more than 1,000 defensive battles.
Yeah.
You don't see numbers like that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you top out at 5,000 battle points offensively, and you can get 10,000 for each one of those, that was enough.
It's like the equivalent of like 200 fights.
Right. Wins.
Yeah.
Wow. So that you got to remember, this was pre-augmentation, pre-breakthrough when multiplayer was first introduced, and I think it was around the same time they did Gears, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was just a wild time. So let's take a look at Darkseid. Enough sort of reminiscing about the past and the other teams. Look at his passive. Empower minions. All bronze characters on Darkseid's team gain plus 300% health and damage. That means their effective health and damage are 4 times what it should be.
Mm-hmm.
So the obvious limitation is that the boost to bronzes make them as good as a Elite 2, maybe, gold. Mm-hmm. Because despite the fact, so you'd think, right? So let's say you look at Nightwing, who's a bronze. 210 health, 210 attack. If you're increasing the base stats, that goes up to 840 and 840, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you look at a low-level gold like Regime Black Adam, 750 and 750.
You'd think it would be better.
Right. But there's an interesting thing because golds increase their stats at a different rate than bronzes for promotions. Mm-hmm. So when you take a bronze, and if the base stat is 100%, then you get to Elite 7, they go up to 240.
Yeah.
If they're silver, they go up to 380%. And golds actually go up to 500%. Mm-hmm. So what you end up with when you've got a max out Elite 7 bronze, they end up being maybe like a medium gold Elite 2. Maybe even a little bit worse. And if you look at Elite 10, the difference is maybe a little bit more because it gets to... Bronzes get to 300%, silvers get up to 500, and golds get up to 650%.
Yeah.
So you got a really sort of stark difference. And the reason why that's a limitation, so people think, okay, so what's the big deal? If you promote Darkseid, remember, at that point, he was one of the 3 top stat characters, right? If you promote Darkseid and put him on a team with bronzes, it's going to be unbalanced. Again, currently, people love to have unbalanced teams. I think the lingo that Scopus Gaming introduced was the high stat character on a team with a couple of other weak characters is that they're the carry.
Mm-hmm.
So, because it's unbalanced, with Darkseid stats being so high, they're going to be a lot higher than his bronze teammates. So, the main offensive threat needs to be Darkseid.
Yeah.
And so here, I mean, on the other hand, because it is just a straight stat boost of both attack and health, Darkseid's bronze teammates get an increase in stats that act more like promotions than leveling up. Mm-hmm. So, you know the way we like to play. We like to play where the characters that we're improving are actually making a difference. That if we're going to be trying to lean into Darkseid's passive to make him good as a teammate, then you don't max out Darkseid so that his bronze teammates are going to be close to him so that his bronze teammates can actually make a decent contribution.
Yeah, because if he's going to be unbalanced anyways, then you don't care that much about bringing the bronze character stats up to
Could have been anybody else.
Yeah.
Could have been anybody else.
Who cares?
Right. And so in this fight, what you're seeing is we probably promoted Darkseid still a little bit too much, but Nightwing is actually making some good contributions. And part of the reason he's able to do that, when you look at the gear at the beginning, right, we're leaning into his ability to both drain power with his special 1, mm-hmm. drain power on his combo ender because we've loaded him with both Razzle Scimitar and the overpowered super. And his passive is to reduce damage by 25%, damage taken from basics. So he becomes a little bit hardier and able to... So even though his health stat might not be high enough to really manage stuff, the fact is that if you don't let him take a lot of special damage...
Yeah.
He ends up being decently...
Moderately survivable.
Yeah, in a fight against a team of golds. So the... Oh, you know what? I got distracted. So, all right. So what I was saying about attack and health, cards level up differently. The health stat tends to increase faster than the attack stat. So when you go from level 1 to level 50, your ratio of attack to health can go from 1 to 1 up to 6 to 11, somewhere around there. And then if you go to Elite 10, it becomes 6 and 13. Mm-hmm. So the health goes up a lot faster. The fact that you're increasing both the attack and health in proportion means that you're making them more the way we like them.
Glass cannons.
Yeah, exactly. More attack. Mm-hmm. So the problem with using Darkseid as your main damage dealer is that he has an unstated damage over time from his special 2. So the damage stat from his special 2 that's listed is about half of what it should be for somebody with the equivalent damage stat. Mm-hmm. So for somebody like Darkseid, in our case, the one we've got for his promotion and his level, his attack stat is just about 33,000. He's doing just about 33,000 damage with the special 2 maxed out. And somebody else comparable, but without a status effect, it should be doing 64,000 damage. Mm-hmm. So it's not unusual, right? Most time when there's a status effect, you're losing half the damage. In his case, it's unstated. And the worst thing is that if his special 2 is blocked, it doesn't complete. So there's a handful of characters whose specials, the animation changes if it's blocked, and the number of hits change if it's blocked. His case, he won't do the last hit. It's the last hit that does the damage over time. So then you get really ripped off. If they block, they're blocking way more than the usual, whatever is it, 50% or 75%. I can never keep them straight, like which is basic and which is specials. Mm-hmm. And so you're blocking Darkseid special 2 is way more effective. So he's not the greatest because then you have to rely on his special 1. And he's not like other characters where it's easy to leverage his special 1 to make it do more damage. So he really needs to be good with...
specials is 25% by default, right?
I can't remember.
Basic is 50. And the reason why I think that is because I remember when it first happened, we were like, oh, well, then for the 25% damage only, it almost doesn't even make sense to block specials because you can generate power.
I think it's the opposite. Can't. I think the specials are 50%. I think we had this discussion 2 weeks ago.
Whatever.
I don't know that it matters. I mean, either way, you want to be blocking both of them, I think.
Yeah.
Because it just does so much damage. But that makes it harder for Darkseid to be the star, which, again, means that it's harder to justify maxing him out because he's not the greatest character. He no longer has the benefit of drawing a lot of defensive attacks if you max him out. Mm-hmm. And it means that he outclasses his bronze supporting team, so it makes them less effective, getting boosted by his passive.
Mm-hmm. It is basic attacks by 25% and special
right,
by
special
50%. Yeah.
I think...
Thank you, Wiki.
Yeah. So I think, he's an interesting character. He's a lot of fun to play with. When early in the game, I think he's probably more useful when you're not promoting him. And then that way you make his bronze teammates that much better. Mm-hmm. And so you can get more out of the bronzes that you've got. In multiplayer, at least.
Yeah. So there we go.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that comment about code switching that you said you wanted or that you should have added?
Yeah, it was just a comment. There wasn't really a question about it, but it was it's
HarveyMan4703 said, "Love these videos, and I thought I was the only one who subconsciously changed their voice towards who you speak to. Code switching, I guess. Thanks, man, for video. Was nice to listen to."
So it's interesting, right? Because we've talked about this in different contexts, and it just seems to come up in ways.
Yeah.
You were mentioning that, when you were playing a video game and with strangers, mm-hmm. and they noticed something about
the way that I was talking.
Yeah, it's neat, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell the...
I talked about that here. That's where you heard about it. So
I'm losing track of stuff then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'll share is that when I was a lot younger and I didn't have nearly as defined of a sense of self, I sort of came to the realization that I would act differently around different groups of people, and I was worried that I was being potentially manipulative or that I didn't have sort of this is one of those sort of terms that only feels meaningful when you're younger and you don't have a sense of self, but I didn't know what the quote-unquote real me was.
Right.
So there's this time where I go, oh man, I'll act differently around all these different people. Which one's me?
I mean, that was sort of the big thing with Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah.
That being phony. like not being yourself. And I think that being phony gets a bit of a bad rap. I mean, sometimes it's not necessarily like there are different aspects to ourselves, and I don't know that it's actually useful or healthy to always be everything you always are to everybody.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things is this sort of concept is very relevant for neurodivergent people, right? Especially within autistic circles. And it's something called masking, right? Which is the idea of sort of, it's very similar to code switching. It is hiding or modulating yourself depending on who you are around.
Right.
And there's this idea within, for autistic people, it can often be effortful and damaging and have negative consequences long term. And the discussion is interesting because masking is something that different people do to different extents. Everybody sort of does it, right? What the real issue comes from the difference in effort it is to different people and your ability to do it or not do it.
The requirement, like whether it's an external force that's saying, yeah, you need to do this to fit in, or whether you do this to choose to move in that space the way you want to.
Mm-hmm. Because, the idea of masking and code switching, like these things are objectively helpful in some circumstances, right? It can be materially beneficial to be different to different people. And, you're obviously not going to speak the exact same way to like a grandparent as you do to like friends who are your age and your peer group, right? But the real question is sort of balancing a sense of self, sort of a consistency in behavior and belief, right? Because one of the things that can happen is that you can display different values, right? There's that sort of discussion around, somebody seeing their partner around their like friends, and then all of a sudden they go, "Oh, that's weird. Why are you like being homophobic as a joke around your like guy friends?" That's like. But then when we're talking, you're not like that, right? And so there's this idea of like what is important to you and the things that you care about and the values that you hold being malleable based off of who you're around. I think that's definitely bad, but sort of those little differences.
But it's not inherently bad in the technique. It's bad when there's certain things that you hide from somebody that you shouldn't be hiding from.
Or when there are negative sort of personal outcomes because it's draining to your energy or whatever. Or when you're like 13 years old and you aren't sure who the real
So this is the perfect, like it ties into so many things. There's a black writer, I don't know how to pronounce his name properly, I'm going to apologize, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who gave this really great answer when, so here's the thing, people say the N-word. It's okay for black people to say it. It's not okay for not black people to say it. And people get up in arms a little bit about that. Well, somebody can say it. Why can't I? And he had like such a great answer. And like I said, I'm going to paraphrase this. It just came to me right now, so I didn't have time to prepare or look it up. But his answer was basically, well, there are certain places and certain things that you say that are appropriate to certain people, but not the other way. So if I call my partner sweetie, baby, and I have terms of endearment for her, it's not appropriate for me to say those to other people.
Yeah.
And this is it's the same sort of thing where part of it is, and I heard this other thing too, where people were talking about, so just because you can do these things in certain situations doesn't mean you do them all the time. It's perfectly natural to pee and poop. There's a place for it.
Yeah.
In the washroom. Yeah. So just because it's natural doesn't mean you get to do it everywhere. If you choose to do it in the kitchen, that's bad. So it's all this, like, I don't even know what the point I'm trying to make is, but it's there's a consistency to it. I think the biggest criticism I remember either hearing or thinking myself when I was younger like you and trying to figure out my own identity and figure out what I want, how I wanted to express myself, that there was something bad about being inconsistent. But there's nothing bad about being consistent. It's not you're being inconsistent. You're actually just being appropriate for different situations.
And one of the interesting things about that is that kind of ties into Western versus Eastern and individualist versus collectivist sort of perspectives and philosophies. So we call it Western versus Eastern often because, you can think about like North American culture versus like Chinese culture.
And that's a little bit racist too, right? Because if you say Western and Eastern, where's the center?
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's
like who are you centering?
There's inherently perspective intrinsic in it. Yeah. But so the basically the idea is that Western and Eastern philosophies have different tolerances for differing and conflicting information.
Right.
Whereas, Western pursuit of truth often seeks to find some singular, objective, externalizable fact.
Yeah.
Eastern principles are a lot more willing to sort of hold things that maybe seem mutually exclusive, hold two pieces of information that don't mesh neatly simultaneously.
Right.
And, if you come from a Western perspective, you go, oh, well, obviously the Western perspective is right? There's things that are true and things that aren't true. But then when you think about how many things are nuanced and complicated in the way that when you often build sort of subsequent layers of complexity or understanding, the things that you sort of learned as the basics become untrue, right? You can think about how in a lot of cases you actually do want to say, oh, well, this is true unless it isn't until it isn't. And it even, most of our most complicated sort of understandings of physics and mechanics, right? All of our models have a place where they break down, right? And the whole thing that we're often trying to do is refine our models so that they increasingly don't break down, right?
Right.
Like under, Newtonian physics, there's a lot of stuff that just, you get to certain like size scales and things stop working. You get to certain sort of temperatures, a certain amount of energy, and you go, oh, well, when stuff gets hot, our models break down for how they're supposed to behave.
Okay, so it's funny you mentioned that. I still have a distinct memory when I first saw the formula of gravitational pull.
Yeah. Which one?
Was the one that was non-Newtonian.
Yeah.
The one that was bigger. And I thought, and it was explained to me, I thought, holy crap, how did somebody figure this out and figure out a way that when you get to the right scale, it becomes Newtonian. It's close enough to be Newtonian to not make any difference.
Yeah.
That will change. Like, to me,
it's almost like a physics simulation in a video game, right? Where it's meant to mimic real life and it can maybe look and feel real, but then it's not a perfect replication of reality.
But it's like the fact that somebody came up with that to me is like magic. Like, to be able to recreate or create a formula that matches the pattern of something that you're seeing.
Yeah. That
changes depending on the situation that you're in, but be consistent with that. I thought, holy moly, that is like kind of spectacular. Yeah. I don't know. It was just, it blew my mind when I first saw that. I still those moments, I distinctly remember that moment and how it felt to learn that. It was neat.
Yeah, no, so I just think that that's kind of interesting, where the idea of inconsistencies and being willing to sit with inconsistencies is definitely a more Eastern collectivist kind of perspective. And the same thing with code switching, right? Where the idea is with collectivist societies, you define yourself very strongly relationally, right?
Right.
So the people in your community, the people who are close to you, are part of who you are.
Right.
And the way that you think and talk about sort of those relationships, they're much more closely ingrained into you. And so in that, if you lose a friend and gain a new friend, you literally, your personhood changes at least a little bit, right? And, obviously when we're talking about individualism and collectivism, it's like average differences, right? So it's that's kind of blowing it up to the most extreme ends of it, right? The visible differences of who you are is who's around you.
Right.
But if in a collectivist culture, the idea that you are different around different people would make sense, right? Because your
built in.
Yeah, your relationships with people actually modify yourself. And, we know that to be true, right? Your friends and family change you. They help you develop, but sort of keeping them, instead of like they have had an impact on you, it's that they are part of you. It's a difference. It's placing yourself as ending sort of with your skin versus placing your sense of self as ending in your sort of the space around you, the people around you.
So a few things occur to me. One, that individualism of Western culture, I blame Ayn Rand. Two, very much is what you're describing to me. I'm picturing water. You pour it into the vessel, it takes the shape of the vessel. So the stuff around you makes a big difference for how you are, even though inherently your fundamental you, there's a you that's not any different, but it's the shape of you has changed so much by what's around you. And I forgot my third point. I had another point.
It's okay. So one thing I'll say that's interesting, that's kind of relating to what you're saying. I would say that it is probably fair to say that we are both relatively more individualistic, just based off of the sort of
more
culture
than
surrounding than the sort of on the individualistic versus collectivistic spectrum.
So what does that mean? when you say we're more individualistic?
That we, you know, are living in North America, socialized here. We come out of, you know, in large part individualistic cultures that we, broadly speaking, I mean, everybody has to put themselves somewhere on the scale, right? I would say that we are probably relatively individualistic. We are surrounded by individualistic politics and social norms and all that stuff. That's what I'm saying. But so what's interesting is you're talking about sort of collectivism in a very positive way. What's another thing that's interesting is that the people that tend to be upheld as within a society tend to be those who trend towards the other side of whatever society you're in. So if you are in, you know, let's say China, right? They'll go, oh, this person is so independent. They're a free thinker. They're so, you know, they've got such a strong sense of self. And then in North America, you go, oh, that person has a really strong sense of community and all that stuff. So whatever society you're in, it's kind of like the grass is greener thing, where people are like, oh, the traits that they value in an individual tend to be opposite to the trends in their country. So it's not, and obviously there are exceptions to this, right? There are people in, you know, the States, for example, who really want to be extra individualistic, right? But that a lot of people tend to see and note and find value in holding elements of that sort of other viewpoint or perspective or system for looking at the world.
Right.
Interesting stuff. But that it's kind of, there's those two trends, right? You trend to either you want to double down or triple down on what your sort of society's set is, or you value sort of the opposite and finding that balance or
no, I now remember what the point I was going to make was in response to something that you'd said about how you change with the people around you, right? That they're parts of you.
Yeah.
And that ties into something that I've always said before, where when people talk about nature versus nurture and their argument sometimes against nurture or nature, I can't even remember which one, but that's, you know, the starting point, the premise that they start with is that the kids in the same family turn out differently. And I've always said, well, each kid is born into a different family. The parents might be the same, but when you're the only child, you're living in a different world than when you're the younger. Than when you're the third or the fourth. Like, you're being born into a different family.
And your siblings aren't exact copies of each other. So you had different siblings. Even if you've only got, you know, one sibling, you each had different siblings.
So I think there feels like an intuitive truth to some of what you're talking about, because we see it in lots of things around us.
Yeah. And well, the interesting thing with the nature versus nurture discussion is that, you know, it's sometimes framed as, oh, is it A or B, right? And that's kind of that like Western way of, oh, what matters more, nature or nurture, right?
Right.
But holistically, in basically every situation, it's both, right? It's at least a little bit of both. Even you think about stuff that you could argue is clearly nature, like hair color, right? You're the sort of, as a base assumption, if I say hair color is determined by genetics, you go, that is true, right? But you think about all the different ways that hair color manifests. So like, you know, the more time you spend outside, right, will change the color of your hair a little bit. You can get bleached. And if you make the behavioral decision to dye your hair, that is another decision that changes your hair, right? And your genes, what sort of your hair is if you don't do anything to it, stays the same. But your phenotype, how you display, is a lot based off of your own personal decisions in terms of your hair. So your hair color actually, depending on what, you know, we talk about sort of genetics, what's in your DNA, but that's often not really a useful descriptor, right? If you ask what color hair somebody has, you're not going to say, well, they have brown hair if they're standing in front of you with, you know, purple hair. You're going to say that person has purple hair, and you go, well, yeah, it's brown in their genes though.
Right, so phenotype versus genotype, how it's expressed.
It's still not a useful thing. So if you think about it in that term, your hair color is actually your baseline, your starting point is genetics. The same way, you know, your starting point for basically everything is how you pop out as a baby, you know, but not even, because what your, you know, parent does while you're in the womb and all that stuff can also change how you pop out as a baby. But a lot of your sort of traits are, as a starting point, are defined by genetics. But then the second things start to be able to act on you, which includes while you're in the womb actually, all of a sudden there is elements of sort of nurture and elements of socialization, all these other stuff that are influencing how stuff ends up. So even, eye color, hair color, all that stuff,
and
functionally is actually a nature and nurture thing.
And we're even glossing over the things like epigenetics.
Yeah. Which is how your genes are expressed.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's influenced by your environment.
That's true. Or even by your parents' environment. There was those studies showing that when a parent went through like a famine or some other sort of poverty event that resulted in food scarcity, like protracted food scarcity, that the kids were at higher risk for obesity. Yeah, because the idea is that there was some genetic expression that taught right on some sort of like biological level, food won't always be around. So when food is around, have as much of it as possible.
Right.
And so it happens in one person. So if you go through poverty or food scarcity or food insecurity, you're more likely to become obese when you have access to as much food as you need and more food than you need. But then it also passes on to the kids. And seemingly there's an epigenetic component to it. You could also say that there's potentially just a normal socialization component to it too, where you have these behaviors and you pass these behaviors on to your kids. But it seems I would need to look at it again, but I seem to remember them saying that there was some sort of epigenetic marker that they were able to track that changed in people who were raised in the same time in the same area based off of whether or not there was food scarcity, and that genetic marker was found in their kids, and it seemed to be correlated with the increased risk of obesity.
We're out of time, but we should probably answer another question to bring it back around to Injustice.
We can do one more. So Cameron 1072 says, I definitely think you have the right idea with Red Sun Batman. As stun supports, him and Static can turn practically, I should pronounce it a little bit different, as stun supports. Like, stun supports is the category of thing they are.
They're stun, they support...
They're support characters who have stun.
Right.
Yeah. Him and Static can turn practically any specialist into a pseudo Luchador Bane, which is really cool. Silver Green Arrow is also good at this, but you need Necron Scythe, as he has a freeze on Special 1. And you're right, Batman's stun chance is definitely not 100%. I usually use a gear like Nth Metal Morningstar or Amazonian Shield and Sword on him to help with the consistency. Great episode as always. Hope you're recovering well after your surgery.
I am, thank you. And I just realized something too. I think I should test this. I've been working with the understanding that the freeze part of Necron Scythe doesn't work with characters that do the freeze and then can step out while the opponent's frozen. It's only with characters that freeze in the middle of their special. So I'm thinking like Godfall Superman, Killer Frost, her special 2. I'll have to test it, but I think that when you freeze using Green Arrow, you do not get the benefit of stun boosted damage using Necron Scythe or Cloak of Destiny.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so that's something you might want to... We'll
have to return to?
Yeah, we might have to come back to.
Or we might forget about and not return to.
Yeah.
In which case Cameron can feel free to bug us about it.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't hurt. There was that time where just recently where we forgot about a comment.
I say bug, but that has negative connotations. It would be reminding us because it would actually be good.
Yeah. I think Cameron's been... If this is the same Cameron, it's been a friend of the channel.
Friend of the show. Frequent commenter. You can I can tell by the way that they talk and the fact that their name has the same fundamental elements of it.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I totally agree with this, right? Like the characters that stun, I think Red Sun Batman would be almost too powerful if he stunned every time, like Static does, because of his ability to do get multiple gear shattering effects on the end of his special 1. And it's enough. I mean, the Red Sun team, when you add Red Sun Green Lantern to it with no critical hits and no stuns against you, it's almost too powerful. And what it does is it takes what, the way you gear a team and do whatever, a lot of it is if you have the choice, if you have the option, it's predicated on a lot of critical hits.
Yeah.
And stun is such a great strategy for leveraging the amount of damage that you do. So I think definitely the Red Sun team originally had a lot of synergy. They still do. Still a powerful team. And if you make them too powerful, I think it almost unbalances the game a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's not nearly as fun.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, the game, if you're playing well, is often not that hard, right?
Right.
Especially once you've got stuff. So you sort of start having to implement your own rules and make your own sort of most fun, right?
Yep.
Because if you're not careful, you can optimize all the fun out where you just have the easiest, fastest possible fights. And that's also fun to try to go for, right? To try to see how fast you can get it, how consistent you can get it. But the actual gameplay, the better job you do with the theory, the less engaging the actual gameplay itself is. And so you have to find sort of, that's where we used to do those low gear score teams and all that stuff.
Right.
Where you want to do stuff, you have to make your own rules to find the most fun.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, very good.
I think that's a good place to end for this week. So to finish up, we'd like to give a huge thank you to our patrons on Patreon.
That would be Michael Devries, Irvin Ruiz, Hoshi127, and Nora Klimek, who are supporting us at the credited level, and the other names that you see across the screen who have been generous enough to have supported us at some point during the pandemic.
So there we go. Thank you so much for your support, and thanks to all of you for watching if you made it all the way to the end of the video. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.